I took a couple days off, but I'm back. We're talking about Paul Moses, who is Robert Moses' brother. What? I'm live streaming the Power Broker. Sorry, David was calling about something. Paul insisted that the will be read in the light of Robert's financial situation at the time his mother died, 1930. It was certainly serious. Having been ousted as Secretary of State by Governor Roosevelt in 1929, in 1930, Robert Moses was not earning any salary at all from his remaining jobs. Aside from expenses, for which he was entitled to reimbursement, Robert Moses, at the age of 41, had no income at all except for what his mother gave him. Now, even with their two girls growing up, Barbara was 13 in 1929, Jane was 11. I really want to know. Okay, so they were teenagers when Robert was making the highway and bridges and stuff. That is so interesting. I want to know what they thought about it. Robert Moses' financial situation was complicated by the fact that for him it was unthinkable that his children attend public school, and he therefore had to pay tuition at St. Agnes's. The family had a nice place to live. Bella had bought him not only the Babylon summer house, but a brownstone at 261 West 70th Street. But he was so strapped that in 1929 he did not have sufficient funds to pay next term's tuition or to make necessary repairs on the Babylon house. Moses had always made a point, both publicly and privately, of insisting that he be a public servant working without pay, refusing Smith's offer of a salary for his Long Island Park Commission job. His disregard for money was a vital part of the public image he had so assiduously cultivated, and the maintenance of this pose in private was no less important to him. But in September 1929, he took what for him was an unprecedented step. In the light of his previous actions, almost a desperate step. On completion of the City Trust report he had written as Moreland Commissioner, he submitted a bill for his services of $10,000 plus expenses. This was an unprecedented amount to ask for about 2 months' work, and Roosevelt, of course, would not have been disposed to grant Moses even a reasonable request. He turned Moses down flat. Moses was constantly being offered high-salaried jobs in industry, but that would mean leaving his public career and his public power. In early 1930, with the mother on whom he had always depended for money dying, he needed money desperately. His mother's own resources, moreover, had been shrinking, largely because she had the same extravagant, prodigal attitude toward money as her two sons. Following her husband's death in 1925, she picked up more checks for Madison House. She made generous contributions to other charities, largely ones that produced some sign of physical accomplishment. How Robert Moses felt about this would be revealed later by a remark he made to LaGuardia in a memo about the Children's Aid Society. Each year, my mother contributed more than she could afford to this organization because of her interest in playgrounds. Although about $1,200,000 of her husband's money had been added to her own substantial inheritance, at the beginning of 1929, her net worth was down to a little more than $1 million. Sometime during this period, moreover, she told Paul to begin entering future gifts to her children on her books as advances. This, Paul says, was proof of a growing awareness that her resources, while great, were not inexhaustible, and of her determination to be fair in dividing up her estate. The purpose of this method of entering advances, he said, was to make clear that they were advances against her estate, and that, to keep the total amount each child received from her the same, they would be deducted from each one's share of her estate. At the time she died, the advances to Robert Moses on her books totaled $37,200. If there were any advances to Paul, the author could find no record of them. Half of her assets were in stocks. The 1929 crash further slashed her assets. In mid-1929, after her death the next year, the value of those stocks was found to have shrunk to $293,649. Her total net worth was down to $690,000. $690,422. She made no secret of her intention to leave about $50,000 to charity. In Paul's analysis, there no longer existed a fund of family capital large enough so that there was, as one of the Moses children had always supposed, plenty for everyone. A fair 1/3 share of Bella Moses' estate would, after the charitable deduction and inheritance taxes and subtraction of $37,200, give Robert Moses about $170,000. The income from $170,000 would certainly never amount to enough to support in any decent style a man without a cent of other income, with 2 houses and 2 children in private school. In Paul's analysis, Robert Moses realized that if he was to continue his precious career and protect his precious image, he needed for himself every cent of his mother's estate that he could get. This is, of course, Paul's analysis. Robert will not discuss it, and there is living no one else who is able to. It is not possible, therefore, for anyone ever to know whether or not Paul's analysis is true, although one part of it seems indisputable. Apart from what he could get from his mother's estate, Robert Moses, 41 years old, had no money to speak of at all. But it is possible to ascertain the truth of Paul Moses' other charge. It is possible to determine whether or not it is true that Robert Moses secretly employed his behind-the-scenes influence in city government to keep his brother from getting jobs he deserved. It is true. No. 6 high officials in that government. Oops, I need to adjust the cords down by my feet. 6 high officials in the government, 6 in a position we know, say so. They are Fiorello LaGuardia's Corporation Counsel, Paul Wendells, his comptroller, Joseph D. McGoldrick, his legislative representative, Reuben A. Lazarus, the chairman of the Civil Service Commission, Paul J. Kern, commission member, Professor Wallace S. Sayre, and one other official who would talk only on the guarantee of anonymity. And there was no official that could be found who said differently. So everyone is agreeing that Robert Moses is screwing over his brother. Although there's climbing the bookshelf, I guess. Paul, the liberal idealist who had always wanted to work for the public instead of for the giant utilities he felt were defrauding the public, was eager to work for a mayor who felt the same way. He certainly had the qualifications for the work. Anxious to regulate utilities more strictly and to probe the assessment and easement concessions they had obtained from Tammany, the new mayor was having difficulty finding electrical engineers with both expertise and the willingness to antagonize. Okay, I lost my place. Oh no, I was watching Pearl go to the window and I totally lost my place. Sorry about that. So the city's having trouble find people with the expertise and the willingness to antagonize the major employers in their field. Paul possessed both. Highly regarded as an engineer, he was also, McGoldrick adds, kind of an engineer with a clause. He was very suspicious of utilities, like LaGuardia, who was also willing to believe that Con Ed was overcharging the city. And there weren't too many engineers on the liberal side because there was too much money to be made working for the utility. Just after LaGuardia's inauguration, Paul had an interview with Wendells, who was at the moment looking on the mayor's behalf for a commissioner of water supply, gas, and electricity. Wendells was impressed. Recalls Kern, Paul Wendells called me and said, "I want you to show this guy to the mayor. He seems just like what LaGuardia needs." Kern was impressed himself. Paul Moses came in and talked about himself, not too modestly, but impressively, and he left his resume with me. His record looked good. Whether as a commissioner or in some other high-level post, Kern recommended to the mayor that Paul be brought into the administration. But there was something standing in Paul's way. Precisely what his brother was saying to LaGuardia about him is not known, although the one reference by Robert to Paul in writing in the mayor's private files consists mainly of a paragraph that could have hardly helped raise questions in the mind of so sharp a lawyer. While it is nobody... Okay, so this is a quote from Robert in writing, I think. While it is nobody's business and purely a family matter, I have not seen my brother for a long time, and I am hardly on speaking terms with him. My only contact with him is in my capacity as a trustee of a fund of which he is the beneficiary. And then asterisks. The paragraph is contained in a brief note Moses wrote in the first months after LaGuardia's inauguration. It is a reply to a letter about Paul that the mayor sent to Moses. The letter is not in the files, and its contents could not be learned. But that he was saying something was obvious. That was quite clear to me. Oh, just from little things LaGuardia dropped, Wendell said. And it also became quite clear to me that for whatever reason, whether Robert made it a condition of his continuation in the administration that his brother not be hired, or whether Robert simply made LaGuardia believe it would be unwise to hire him, he wasn't going to be hired. Shortly, it also became clear to Kern. Having received no reply to his first recommendation that Paul be hired, he decided to press a bit. At one of my half-hour sessions with LaGuardia, he recalls, I took a chance and brought this up, saying, with the shortage of good engineers, what's wrong with this guy? LaGuardia's response was, don't bother me. I can't have him around as long as Bob is here. The more Wendell's and Kern saw of Paul, the more their respect for him grew. Remarkable mind, remarkable, Wendell said, like the brother, reaching out for a whole problem and pulling the whole thing in at once. Kern, who frequently ate dinner with him, found in him another quality that characterized his brother. He was very good at sizing up people, Kern says. When I was on the Civil Service Commission, I'd often ask him about some guy, and he'd tell me he's no damn good for such and such a reason. And we'd hire him, and sure enough, he'd turn out just that way. Wendell's saw to it that Paul did get some work, hiring him as an expert witness in condemnation cases involving utilities and as a consultant to a committee studying traffic unification, and later putting him in charge of a 33-man staff reassessing utilities properties. At the fee he asked, $50 per day. Listen, Wendell says, I checked his qualifications. He was a top engineering consultant. He was working $50 a day of anyone's money. In fact, during several years in which Paul held this last job, the utilities assessments were raised more than $200 million per year. But these were temporary jobs, and Paul's repeated attempts to obtain a more permanent one were met with rebuff. He was earning over $12,000 per year from his consulting work for the city, but the depression was cutting deeper and deeper into the profits from the swimming pool. He needed a job, and he became very bitter over his inability to get one. He did not know or suspect the real reason. Ironically, he thought it was Wendell's who was keeping him from getting one. Listen, I wasn't asking for a handout, he would say years later. I was recommended by the engineering societies. I knew more about this stuff than anyone else around. I was entitled to at least one of all those jobs. Wendell's, Lazarus, all those fellows. They were pretty shabby to me. I wanted to get something in public life, and no one would say a word for me. After Wendell's resigned in 1938, he could not obtain even consulting work. At first, that did not worry him. His services had always been sought by many engineering firms. But now, for some reason, he could not understand, even at the firms which once sought him more eagerly, were totally unwilling to even consider employing him. All through 1939, he hunted for a job in the profession in which he was an acknowledged expert, and he could not find one. His financial difficulties were compounded because he possessed the Moses prodigality toward money. Remarried to a divorcee with 2 children, he had undertaken to send them to private school and college. He had moved his new family into an expensive Lower Fifth Avenue apartment. All through between 1934 and 38, he had been earning a substantial income. He had lived to its limit, saving nothing. And he had refused to, perhaps because of his upbringing, he had been unable to, put financial limits on the Upper Darby recreation complex that may have been his pitiful attempts to rival Jones Beach. He kept pouring money into the Lanark pool for modern locker rooms, a dance hall, another restaurant. In 1938, with finances flush, he had put a $33,000 mortgage on the property to finance the construction of an amusement building. As his plans for the building grew larger and larger, so did its costs. Coffee break. In 39, with the $33,000 spent and the building still not finished, he encumbered the property with a second mortgage. The building was still uncompleted, no receipts were yet being earned by it, and suddenly the receipts earned by the pool and restaurant were being gobbled up by interest payments. One morning, the morning on which the last dreams of Paul Moses' life turned to ashes, there arrived at his office a real estate tax bill that he had no money to pay. The banks, learning of the situation, initiated foreclosure proceedings. He was reduced to borrowing from his wife's aunt, then from her mother, securing a $12,500 loan from the latter by giving her another mortgage. He desperately needed a good summer. Instead, there was a polio scare in Philadelphia. Few people dared swim in public pools. The $12,500 melted away. Presented with a $7,500 bill from his attorney, he was unable to pay it, and the attorney sued him. His wife's mother had died. In desperation, he had his wife assign the mortgage she had inherited from her to the attorney. He fell behind on federal income tax payments, and interest on them was mounting by the day. Drawing tighter and tighter around this once gay, elegant, free spirit was a net of debts too snarled to permit entry. Oh, bummer. What an old-timey reason for a pool to have a bad summer, a polio scare. The marriage melted away with the money. Moving into a cheaper apartment was too agonizing for a man of Paul's pride to contemplate. By the end of 1938, however, he had no choice but to move. He had no money to pay the rent. He had to move in with his in-laws. Using every cent he could lay his hands on to try to save the pool, for a while he moved with some of his elegant suits into a tiny bare room behind the pool office so that he wouldn't have the expense of commuting costs to Philadelphia. He let other bills slide. He and his wife were being dunned by the butcher, the grocer, by a department store, and even for $100 by a maid they had let go. He lived on $25 a week, used every other cent the pool earned to pay off his debts, and in some weeks, in which a bill or demand for taxes became too pressing, he was unable to take even the 25. When he had to come to New York in 1939, the year in which his brother moved into the expensive apartment on Gracie Terrace, he slept in a Salvation Army lodging house. Pride made him conceal his poverty so well that acquaintances who, meeting him on the street, noticed that the cuffs on his expensive suits and shirts were ragged. Though this was an affection on the part of this man who had always cared so much about his appearance. To those who invited him to their homes for dinner, however, it was more difficult to conceal the truth. He might forget and cross his legs, and then friends such as the Proppers, who were so kind to him that he would often drop in on them when he happened to be in the neighborhood. They saw that there were holes in his socks and in the soles of his shoes. They saw from the way he ate dinner that he hadn't been eating many. Not only did he not have enough money to buy clothes or shoes, they realized this man, whose brother was host daily at lavish luncheons, did not have enough money to buy food. He got thinner and thinner, Mrs. Propper says. He was not really getting enough food. We kept him overnight a number of times. I really don't think he had any place to sleep. We offered to lend him some money, but he wouldn't take any, not from us at any rate. I used to wish he had. Poor Paul. Genuine friends, such as the Proppers, moreover, saw changes in... I don't even know what to make of the word moreover. He uses it so much. Totally fine, but I'm just commenting. Okay, genuine friends saw changes in Paul that saddened them more than the changes in his appearance. To people who remembered his wit, the holes that gaped most glaringly were not the holes in his shoes, but the holes in his spirit. Paul Moses, they realized, was being eaten away by a terrible bitterness. We had him to some dinner parties, but he was very difficult to handle, Mrs. Propper said. Bitter, frustrated possibly, opinionated. This was when this Moses side came to the fore, this brushing aside, this arrogance. He was impossible. Paul was his own worst enemy. At the heart of Paul Moses' bitterness was his hatred for his brother. Its spark was what Paul felt was injustice in the administration of the $100,000 trust fund, of which his brother was a trustee. Their mother had intended that Paul get from that fund an annual income of several $1,000s a year, but he wasn't getting a cent. The fund's trustees, Robert Edna, cousin Wilfred Oppenheim, it's spelled Openhym, and a bank, had invested Paul's money in a guaranteed mortgages, a device common before the Depression, under which a title company, for a fee, guaranteed principal and interest payments and undertook the responsibility of seeing to it that the owner paid his real estate taxes. But 2 of the 3 mortgages involved were caught in the crash of the real estate market in New York, during which thousands of owners defaulted on payments and title companies, unable to meet them all, collapsed. In normal times, the bank, which was managing the trust fund for the trustees, would have received notification of the default in taxes and interest payments from the title companies and would have foreclosed, saving the principal. But in the general confusion, the bank somehow did not check on the tax situation until the owners of the 2 properties had been in default on taxes and other city charges for more than 2 years. To keep from losing the entire $24,000 investment they had made in one building, the trustees, foreclosing on it, had to sell it for what they could get, $7,500. To keep from losing the $65,000 they had invested in the other, a loft building at 168 The Bowery, they had to pay off $8,000 in taxes and make repairs costing $7,000, which they did by putting a $15,000 second mortgage on it. During the 5 years in which they were paying off this mortgage, the trustees deducted the payments from what Paul would have received. There was nothing left for him. Between October 3, 1935 and August 3, 1939, almost 4 years, he received nothing from his trust funds. By the time the mortgage was paid off, real estate values on the Bowery had plummeted permanently. The rent earned by the building into which most of his inheritance had been sunk barely met mortgage payments and taxes. His income from the trust was henceforth going to be barely $1,000 a year. I think I'm going to stop there. All right, well, this was just another bummer of a section, but it's really interesting to hear the financial situation. Poor Paul. Really weird that Robert Moses didn't let anyone hire him. Kind of evil. All right, goodbye.